Welcome, and thank you for coming to Story Hour in the Morrison Library. Thank you, Carrie Groner, for reading with us today. And I invite you back for our next author, Adam Hochschild, on February 9th in the new year. At this time, I ask you to silence your cell phones, and I invite Vikram Chandra to introduce Carrie Groner. Thank you.
Hi. Welcome to Story Hour, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Carrie Groner to Story Hour as well. Carrie grew up in the Midwest, and then he earned his BFA in directing from the Carnegie Mellon School of Drama. He has worked as a journalist for many years, covering theater, film, healthcare, science, and environmental issues. He's studied Buddhist meditation and philosophy for a long time, from 1986 to 2002. And in 2009, he received his MFA in fiction from the University of Arizona. He's published a lot of short fiction in many venues, and it has won numerous awards, including the Glimmer Train Fiction Prize for elaborate preparations for departure, the Hackney Award for The Meat Line, and Southern California Review for Understanding the Sky. And I have to say, I was jealous of all of those titles. I wanted to steal them. In 2011, he published his first novel, Exiles. In this book, an American cardiologist named Peter Scanlon takes his 17-year-old daughter to Nepal in order to work in a free health clinic for 1 year. Since Kathmandu serves as a meeting ground for exiles and expatriates, their encounters leave Peter and Alex disillusioned but wiser about their own culture and the larger world. In the Kirkus Review, the reviewer noted that Carrie, I'm quoting now, shines a unique light on a remote, exotic land in his self-confident and culturally rigorous debut. His tale of a doctor and his beloved daughter shows the current country's turmoil with a palette that is as affectionate as it is startling. Even the most jaded reader will be on the edge of their seats as the author carries the story home. A fast-paced but emotionally resonant story about the bonds that hold fast when we're far from home. In Booklist, Carolyn Kubis wrote, Groner does an excellent job of capturing the realities of life in this war-torn country, from rampant poverty to the beauty of a cremation ritual to the enduring hope of a besieged people in a spectacular land. And as somebody from South Asia, I think what struck me most was that this was a foreign view, but something that got the intricacies and the complexities exactly right, with the tourists, a Maoist guerrilla movement running in the countryside, and the various interactions of people of various nationalities and ages. And I think so it's exactly right that Exiles was named one of the best books of the year by the Chicago Tribune. Carrie and his wife live in the Bay Area. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Groner to Story Hour. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikram, for that lovely introduction. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's great to be here. When I was getting ready for my first book tour a few years ago, I was reading these sort of advice columns along the lines of, for writers, you know, what to do when you're expecting, what to expect when you're expecting an audience. One of the things they always agreed on was that you should never read too long, because after 10 minutes, your listeners begin to hate you, and after 15, they will rise up like villagers with pitchforks. I took this advice at the time, but I thought it was ridiculous. So I was very pleased when I learned that Cal had this wonderful venue where you could come if you chose and read an entire story and ideally not be impaled. The bad news is that most of my stories are too long even for this. I'm just finishing a collection now which has stories set all over the world. In Micronesia, in Tucson, in Greece, in the Midwest, several set in the Bay Area, one set in a kind of indefinable God's realm. And so they all take at least an hour to read, and so that was clearly impossible. But I do have this one. It's set in Moscow in 1993 during the attempted coup against Yeltsin. And it can actually be read in about a half an hour. It's sort of continuing the theme of the country is in decline and about to disintegrate, so it's suddenly relevant again. Yeah, welcome to Sanity Island. Don't get voted off. So that's what I'm going with. This is called The Meat Line. Irina pressed her hat down tightly with one hand as she hurried up the street against the wind. She was afraid she wouldn't make it to the shop by closing. It was August, but she was still weak from a late spring flu, and if she wasn't fortified by a little beef or lamb every couple of days, the stupid hacking cough returned and forced her to bed. To make matters worse, the country was falling to pieces. The Gang of Eight had commandeered the Kremlin, and Yeltsin and his cronies were crammed into the presidential palace like cucumbers in a crock, surrounded by tanks and pickling in vodka. She'd seen it all on the news, and if things went to hell, she'd be back to cabbage and potatoes, the diet of her ancestors. Ancestors who had, for the most part, been planted under crude whitewashed crosses before they were 50. By their standards, she was practically immortal already. A drunken soldier with a hooker on his arm stumbled into her path. She veered past them, cursing softly. All Moscow was now officially a whorehouse. If you weren't a whore, you were a pimp, and if you weren't a pimp, you were a John, and if not a John, then a drunk. Soldiers might be all three at once and tubercular besides. She sometimes wished for a good pandemic so the country could just start over. If she died too, so be it. She was egalitarian. She detested Stalin, of course, but you had to give it to him. The old bastard knew how to purge. She checked her watch. 2 blocks to cover in 3 minutes. She thought she could make it. 30 years ago, even 20, it would have been a waltz. But now her hips felt as if someone had jabbed steak knives into them. She'd begun to hobble like a crone, which was humiliating and made her teeth grind with fury. That quack dentist had said she was wearing them down at night, angry and aching, even in her sleep. Time had become a sort of bizarre hallucination. In what seemed a matter of months, she'd been transformed from a slender and vital young woman to a thick-waisted factory manager to a broken-down, invisible old cow. A cow wobbling down the conveyor to the bolt gun and the axes. Twice in the last month, she'd nearly been run down on the street because people had apparently become incapable of seeing her. She'd taken to sneaking glances at her reflection in store windows just to make sure she was still there. She wasn't. Some hag was always passing by instead. The old bitch wore shabby imitations of Irina's clothes and a wrinkled mask, lifelike but absurd. She passed one of the new private stores where the meat was good and there was hardly any line, but even the cheap cuts in such places were more than her monthly pension. Who could pay such prices? Where was all the money coming from? She knew very well, of course, corruption, bakshish, mafiosi, oligarchs. Russia was the corpse of a hog, yet it appeared to sleep contentedly, looking just a little bloated until suddenly the maggots exploded from its guts. Now Yanayev and Kryuchkov and their ass-licking cronies were grabbing even the bones for themselves. You could change the labels, but this was still a land of czars and peasants. Irina spat, thinking of it, and almost splattered the yellow glob onto the jeans of a young man walking the other way. Blue jeans. Why not just wear the American flag? The man shot her a nasty look, and she stuck her chin out at him defiantly. Come on, she thought. You think you're tough? If you're under 60, you don't know what tough is. She'd almost made it to the shop, But as she headed toward the big glass door, a gust blew off her hat. She snatched at it, but she was too slow. Storm clouds were blooming up behind the buildings, and she knew she'd want the hat, but it skittered down the street like a rolling hubcap as people stepped nimbly aside to let it pass. It sailed past the man in the jeans. He saw it and glanced back at her, grinning maliciously. One of his top front teeth was gold. Even he had money. It was 1 minute till 6, and Irynia saw the security guard step toward the inside of the door with the key in his hand. She gave up on the hat and pushed her way in. The guard glared, gripping the key ring, which was attached by an elastic umbilical to a chrome retractor on his belt. Irynia took her place at the end of the line, breathing fast and swaying a little. The guard locked the door and turned his back to it, then put his arms behind him and fixed his gaze on the far wall, where Irynia could just make out the flaked remains of a mural showing muscular men and women in bright clothes smiling gaily in the sunshine as they harvested wheat on a collective farm. Apparently, this was the best they could manage, absent official sanction, for depictions of celestial paradise. Irynia forced her lips into a polite smile. There was still a place for civility, she hoped, but the guard ignored her. She turned toward the front of the line and started counting. 13 people ahead of her, which meant they had 2 minutes apiece to be served before the final closing at 6:30, when anyone still waiting would be forced to return the next morning. But she knew, they all knew, only the naive waited for tomorrow when there were tanks in the streets. Sonia was working the counter, thank God. She was radiant, thin and pale, her wispy blonde hair unkempt. She would be 28 now, but her blue eyes gleamed as brightly as when she was a child. She was, in fact, the reason Irynia went out of her way instead of just going to the butcher near her home. More than once, when purchasing her meat, Irynia had been tempted to blurt out the truth about the situation. But the shop had at one time been a bank, and the high, cold room with its fluted columns and scuffed stone floor amplified every word. Anything she whispered would be overheard by everyone, and besides, Sonia might think she was a lunatic. The guard let a customer out, and Irynia shuffled a half step forward. A little ahead in line stood a woman wearing a black beret. A felt hat from France. What sort of Persian could afford such luxuries? The woman chattered at the man behind her, batting her eyes fearfully, making the most of the chaos outside. "Can you imagine?" she whispered urgently. "Who knows how things will be tonight?" Perhaps she was hoping for an escort home and a little something besides. Another whore, almost certainly. Irynia wouldn't be caught dead in such a hat. Sonia was bundling packets of pork, hamburger, and sausage for a hawk-like woman in her 30s. The woman left briskly, her heels hammering the floor, as if she were hurrying home to devour the meat raw. The shop reeked of flesh and congealed blood. Today, Irynia could even smell fish, though it was clearly past its prime. The last time she bought cod, the flesh was pocked with blisters that oozed something foul-smelling when opened with a knife. Irynia had carefully excised them and cooked the rest of the meat, hoping for the best, but the first bite gagged her. It was slippery and fetid and vile, so she fed it to the cat, who wolfed it without a qualm. Irynia had mentioned the bad fish to Sonia the next time she came into the shop, but Sonia just shrugged as if she had nothing to do with it. It wasn't her fault, Irynia knew. A man in a threadbare trench coat wearing a toupee that had slipped sideways on his head picked up his bundles, put them in a soiled paper bag, and started for the door. The guard pulled the keys out on their little string. Irynia shuffled forward, her legs beginning to ache. A country of long lines was no place for an old woman. She had to wear extra thick stockings now for support, and they looked like sagging, flesh-colored elephant hide. She wondered what it must have been like to live in a place like Florida, where there was warmth and salt water to ease the aches out of you and no lines to stand in. Sure, there were hurricanes, so you nailed up some plywood and listened to music on battery power for a couple of days. This constituted a crisis. 20 minutes left. Once, all the meat had been sold by the time she made the front of the line. This was a year ago, before the illness. She'd been so upset she took her money and got drunk. She almost never touched alcohol. She didn't really like it, and it was costly anyway. But oh, she was happy that night. She put on Stravinsky and pranced around a rite of spring as if she were a young doe. The next morning, she needed 4 aspirin just to get out of bed. Punished even for dancing. In her heart, she was still a pagan, but the rest of her idiot body had converted to Puritanism. Irenia noticed her closeness to the woman in front of her and took a small step back. The woman's hair fell untidily around her ears and neck. A sour odor arose from her and competed with the remnants of her perfume, a kind of musk that hung about her as weakly as an uncertain ghost. Mixed with the rancid smells of the shop, it was all a trifle nauseating. Irenia became aware not only of this nearness, but also of the woman's to the tall man behind whom she stood, and then of his to the teenage girl before him, so that by extension, she began to feel a curious proximity to everyone in the line, as if it were not composed of individuals, but rather formed the body of some segmented insect that stretched all the way to the counter, all one being that was feeding on the meat. Comrades, she thought bitterly. Still, there was a tribal quality to it that had made her long for something lost, something indefinable. She watched Sonia and felt this longing extend out and embrace her too. Her beautiful niece, Natasha's daughter, her only living relative. Sonia knew nothing about any of this, of course. Irenia still had her pride, and like any petty tyrant, it demanded secrecy. 3 decades before, when they were nervous about their biological clocks and the famine of available men, Irenia and Natasha had fought viciously over a tall, handsome accountant named Dmitri. He slept with Irenia a few times, but ultimately proposed to Natasha. Whenever Irenia saw her sister after that, she felt as if she'd been impaled on a lance pulled fresh from the forge. Sometimes it pierced her chest, sometimes her gut, but it was always exquisitely sharp and hot. It would have been one thing if he dated them both casually, then made up his mind in some honorable way. But to try out the goods and decide what was up to par and what wasn't? When did Natasha become so accomplished in bed? Or even worse, what if he decided that Natasha was more intelligent or funny, a better person, more likely to make him happy in day-to-day life? Then, when Sonia was born, it was the final insult, like having someone pour shit over your head and promenade you through Red Square so everyone could have a laugh. In retrospect, Irenia realized she'd gone a little crazy with envy. She cut off all contact with her sister. They had friends in common who urged Irenia to let bygones be, but she simply couldn't do it. She'd have preferred vomit to pass her lips before forgiveness. Natasha eventually got more than anyone deserved, and not in a good way. Dmitri disappeared shortly after Sonia's 4th birthday. There were rumors he'd been involved in bookkeeping irregularities at Gazprom, and presumably he'd finished his days under a shallow mat of permafrost near some godforsaken railway station on the steppe. At the time, Irenia had found this vaguely satisfying, but she was sorry for the child. An old couple took their packages. Arinia inched forward. 15 minutes. The guard pulled open the door to let the couple out. The smell of rain came in on fresh, humid air. The sky had turned to greenish ink and the wind blew ferociously. The rain cut the air at an angle, spattering the pavement with great dark drops. At the front, Sonia greeted the next customer with a weary smile. She had been the most beautiful child Arinia had ever seen. She had loved Sonia as if she were her own, though of course from a distance. She kept track of her through those same friends, sent money and birthday gifts with their names attached. One day when she followed Sonia to school, as she sometimes did, hovering unobtrusively half a block back, she was delighted to see the child wearing the new red jacket she'd bought her. A perfect fit, and she'd only guessed at the size. She wanted to pretend to be a stranger, to go ask Sonia how she liked the coat, but of course she would never do anything so foolish. It was too late for that now. In fact, it had been too late years ago. Natasha was killed in a car accident when Sonia was 19. Arinia went to the funeral and even surprised herself by crying a little. But it didn't seem like the right time to introduce herself to Sonia, who was there with a couple of friends her own age. Natasha had been spiteful, even though she was the victor in that tawdry little war, and apparently she'd never told Sonia she had an aunt. Arinia tried to devise a way to make herself known to Sonia without looking as if she'd come begging for affection or was some kind of con artist or crazy person. But with each passing month after Natasha's death, the prospect became more awkward until finally she gave it up. How could she explain? What would she say? Sonia might have been her daughter if things had gone differently, but they had gone as they had gone. There had been a chance of such things once. In her last year of high school, Arinia had fallen in love with another student, Andrei, who wanted to be a poet. He was a thin, sensitive boy, and this was in a Russia where poets could still be national heroes, so the goal wasn't completely impractical. But it was also a Russia of universal conscription into a notoriously brutal army. Andrei, who was the least likely soldier Arinia had ever seen, was gone only 5 weeks before he was killed in some kind of hazing incident, the details of which were never divulged. She remembered his kind, intelligent eyes, his beautiful hands, his uncanny insight into people that seemed to belong to a much older man. He loved children and said they should marry and start a family when he returned. At that young age, Arinia wasn't so eager. Children are just animals, she'd said, only half joking, except they don't give you milk or eggs or wool. Andrei laughed. Watch a woman feeding her chickens, then watch a woman playing with her child. Tell me who's happier. Tell me which one's getting more sleep, she replied. But she adored him and smiled slyly as she said this. Later, in her 20s and 30s, she'd sought solace in casual affairs. She was only flesh and blood, after all. But in all her life since then, she'd never felt such profound love for another human being, except possibly for Sonia herself. It struck her, as she thought about it now, that Dmitri had really meant nothing to her. It was the combat with Natasha she'd wanted, and she didn't even know why. But for some reason, the low stakes had made it all the more painful. If you lost something you cared about, you could at least console yourself with righteousness. But to fight so nastily over a man like Dmitri, well, it was absurd. Like getting pulled through the muck in those stupid tug-of-wars they used to have on the farms in the summers. Another woman left the shop, but before the guard could relock the door, 2 men in shabby leather jackets pushed past him and came inside. They were soaked, their collars up, their hair greased and matted by the downpour. The lean one's face looked acid-pocked, his mouth a tight sphincter of disgust. The big man had a broad baby face, his eyes bright green, his lips as full and wet as those of a carp. The guard moved to stop them, but they gave him a look. He dipped his chin and let them pass. He locked the door and they walked to the front of the line, continuing their conversation. "Bitch found out I was serious," said the pocked man, and the other one laughed the kind of big theatrical laugh you'd expect from a cheap magician at a sideshow. "Surprise," he said. "Thought she'd throw out her jaw getting it in. I was worried about her goddamn teeth." Sonia glanced at them nervously and continued filling an order. They were now 7 in line, then Irina and the guard, who checked his watch. In a perfect world, Irina thought, these men would vanish into vapor. Also, there would finally be enough food and medicine. Women would not be assaulted in the streets. Governments and corporations would become honest. Society would be civil. Courts would be fair. Wars would end. Anyone who drove a tank onto a city street would get a ticket and have to go to traffic school, where they would be reprimanded, educated, and entertained by a stand-up comedian the way they did it in California. "How much is left?" said the baby-faced man. "What you see," Sonia replied, indicating the counter. Irina ached to hear the quaver in her voice. The guard stood with eyes downcast, his hands clasped behind him as firmly as if he'd been cuffed. "Put it all in here," said the pock-faced man. He produced a big canvas mailbag stained with blotches of crimson. It looked like something you'd use to carry severed heads. The people in line turned to look at one another. Eyes met, then flicked away. The room felt warmer. Irina opened her coat, and the woman with the beret took it off, then dropped it. She was apparently too afraid to pick it up, so she just stood there. "Move," said the pock-faced man, and Sonia was crying. She wiped at her nose with the back of her hand. The man slapped her. "Don't get your snot in it," he said. My life is already nearly over, already, Irina thought. She hadn't felt this light in years. She seemed to sail to the front of the line as if borne by angels. Her heart pounded so fiercely that the room throbbed before her eyes and her breath grew short. "Keep your hands off her," she said. "If you're so tough, slap me." Sonia's eyes widened with alarm. The big man laughed his clown-like laugh. "Sit down, Grandma," he said. "We want fresher meat than you." "To hell with what you want," shot back Irina, her hair bristling at the back of her neck. "We need it more than you do. We waited." At first, she thought the explosion in her chest was from a bullet, but then she was on the stone floor and there didn't seem to be any holes in her. Her hip hurt so badly it might have been cracked. Blood dripped from her nose. Apparently she'd hit her head. It wasn't even a punch. She'd only been shoved. How could she possibly be this weak? The others in the line looked at her briefly, then returned their gazes to the floor like the guard. The pock-faced man smiled and said to the other one, "I don't care if you want to." The big man reached into his coat, and Irina knew perfectly well what he had in there. "Please," said Sonia, "it's hard enough to clean this place. Just take it and go." The pock-faced man took the bag from her and handed it to his friend. "You owe me then," he said. "Fine," said Sonia, looking down at the counter and tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. Her cheek was still red from the slap. "I owe you." They started for the door. Then the pock-faced man turned and came back to Erinia. He squatted on his haunches. "If I ever come back and you're here," he said, "you're going to watch me fuck that little bitch right up the ass, and it'll be the last thing you see." Erinia, lying there, began to roar. She sounded like a great wounded lioness without words or language, a creature made entirely of rage. She roared, then roared again and then again until the men had left. They were laughing as they walked outside. Erinia's voice briefly echoed around the cavernous room, then everything fell quiet. The people in line stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Sonia helped her to a bench. Blood still dripped from her nose. The others began to make their way to the door. "You old fool," Sonia said. "You can't come back here now. Do you understand?" "I couldn't let him slap you." "How could you live this long and be so stupid?" Sonia said. She pulled a dirty towel from her apron and dabbed at Erinia's nose. "It's all right," Erinia said. She gently pushed Sonia's hand away. "It'll stop when it's ready." The security guard came over. "I need to lock up," he said. Sonia turned on him, her expression fierce. "What good are you?" she demanded. "What's your job supposed to be?" "It's 6:30, he replied evenly. "Right now, my job is to lock up." Sonia glanced out at the rain and turned to Erinia. "Don't you even have a hat?" "I did." "Bring me that thing on the floor," Sonia said to the guard. He went and got it. It was the black beret. She put it carefully on Erinia's head, as if Erinia were a child. "I should help you get home, I suppose," Sonia said. It didn't sound like she really wanted to. Erinia realized with a kind of falling sensation that she no longer had to pretend to be a stranger the way she did when she'd followed Sonia home from school. She was a stranger. She pulled the humiliating hat down and gathered her feet under her. She wasn't ready to stand yet, but she thought she would be soon. "Come on, Granny," said the guard. "Chop, chop." "Fuck your mother," said Erinia. "Fuck your mother and your father and you little eunuch." "That's not very nice now," said Sonia. She was smiling. It was Natasha's smile, but without any of the meanness. It was so beautiful. "You're my niece," whispered Erinia. "You're the only person I have." It felt so good to finally say it that it brought tears to her eyes. Sonia turned to the guard. "She's knocked herself silly," she said. "Help me get her up." "I mean it," said Erinia, aware that she must sound a little desperate. "It's the truth." "Of course," said Sonia indulgently. They lifted her to her feet, then Sonia took Erinia's arm in hers and led her to the door. When they were outside, Sonia unlinked her arm and put a newspaper over her head. The guard pulled down the metal barricade, locked up, and trotted off, whistling something. Erinia steadied herself against the building. A young man walked up, and Sonia put her arms around him. "Yuri," she said, "we were robbed again." "Assholes," he said. He slid a cigarette out of the pack and lit it. "You hungry?" "You know I am," said Sonia. She pulled the cigarette from his lips and took a drag. He lifted the newspaper and kissed her damp forehead. She turned to Erinia. "Can you find your way?" "I won't come back. I don't want you to be hurt," said Erinia. She wasn't sure if she was still crying or if it was just the rain. She was glad for the coolness of it, though. "I'm sorry," said Sonia. She and Yuri started off, their arms around each other. Then she hesitated and turned back. "The beret looks good on you. You should keep it." Irina watched them go. The rain grew colder, and soon it was hitting as hard as hail. She pulled the hat down tighter and began to walk. Her hearing became acute. Maybe it was the blow to the head, but she seemed to be floating above the city with her hands cupped behind her ears. The birds had fallen still. Car tires hissed on wet roads. Electricity hummed in the streetlights. People were talking before dinner in their houses. The rain touched buildings, roofs, trees, streets, cars, people, its million fingers tapping everything all at once, pressing down with the full weight of the heavens, tender and relentless. In one part of the city, they were loading shells into the guns of tanks. The tanks rumbled along the pavement, rattling teacups and shaking books off of shelves. Children in nearby apartments began to wail, then hid behind sofas and under beds. How could life go on in such a way? People fixing supper, tending to their bare-gummed babes, and to the old ones, toothless as well, sighing in dusty chairs. And they were loading the cannons? How was it possible to hear so much and understand nothing of it? Nothing was comprehensible anymore. After a while, all this subsided mercifully, and Irina found herself wandering down some road with only the sounds of nearby cars, of her feet splashing, of her shallow, childlike breathing. She stopped to read the street sign but couldn't make it out. An old man walking a dog half bald with mange stopped and watched her. "It's dangerous out tonight," he said. "You look a little lost." They stood under the orange cone of light from a street lamp. Rain seemed to materialize as it entered the light. The dog strained at the leash, smelling something in the bushes. This man had a quiet kindness in his eyes that reminded Irina of Andrei. He could have been poor Andrei, 50 years on, finally grown into the age he'd always been, his precocious wisdom at home now in an old body. He was worried about her? From what vanished civilization had he appeared? "Do you know where you are?" he asked. "Is there something I can do for you?" He seemed even more afraid than she was, just as Andrei had always been. She would reassure him. This much she knew how to do, even though it required her to fib a little. "Thank you," she said. "You're very kind, but I know my own way home." Thanks. You guys want to do questions? Are there? Okay. The floor is open.
I have a question. Do you do a lot of research about the setting and the time?
Yeah,
Come up with the details?
yeah. Oh, sorry. The question is, do I do a lot of research for these stories that are set in other places? And the answer is yes.
At what point do you feel like you can go from, the more intellectual act of doing the research to really getting inside the characters and making them place your own?
Oh, I think the characters always come first. There's sort of a gestalt of a story that seems to arise first, and then you realize you don't know enough to write it, so then you have to go find out. But the kind of spirit of it is already there and in you, so you don't get like too distracted. That's my experience anyway. Yeah. Yes?
How do you get your ideas? Like, where does all this start? First of all, you did a wonderful job. I could see everything with my eyes wide open. I thought you were brilliant. But how do you get your ideas? Where does this?
It helps to grow up in a massively dysfunctional family, I think. So you develop a rich inner life to survive. Other than that, I have no idea. They just come up. Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes, well, that's sort of a not a very good answer. Sometimes it's external. It's like you'll overhear it's like when I was in grad school in Tucson, I was in a parking lot after buying groceries, and this guy came up to me and just put on this brilliant scam. Really well thought out, well structured narrative, right, about how he got to his dire situation. It was all bullshit, but it was really well done, and I thought, well, this guy's kind of in the story business too, you know. So I gave him some money, and then I turned that into a short story because I thought it was such a great scam that you could build a whole story around that. So yeah, so sometimes it's outside, sometimes it's inside. It's really hard to say. Yes?
How did you make the transition from your training in directing and drama into fiction writing?
It was sort of gradual. I wasn't in theater very long. By the time I was like in my late 20s, I was pretty much out of it. But then I was working as a theater critic. And then a guy, my boss, who had employed me when I was working as a theater critic, then started a healthcare magazine. So then I started writing about healthcare. And so then after writing about healthcare for a few years, I decided that I really also wanted to be writing about fiction too. So I wasn't just doing that because otherwise I would go nuts. So yeah. Yes?
You sometimes start with the theme and then build the story around that.
No. I know there are some people who do that. It's just kind of not how I am. I usually, after I'm like 5 or 6 drafts in, I'll recognize the theme sometimes, I'll see, oh, this actually does have a theme. And one thing I realized recently when I was rereading all the stories in the collection is that at least at some level, they're all about class. There's always class tensions in my stories. And I had no idea until I read them all together. It just hadn't occurred to me. So it's just kind of like that. Some of that stuff is sort of stealth. Yeah. Yes?
Have you traveled to the places that you write about? Moscow?
A few of them, a few not. I grew up in the Midwest, so my Midwestern stories are, informed by that. And I have about 3 stories set in the East Bay, so like that.
How about Kathmandu?
Actually, no. Haven't been there. But I had several friends who had lived there for extended periods of time, 2 of which had taken their children over and worked in health clinics. So I could do long interviews with them to get all that information, get the details of what it's like there, and so far it seems like it's okay. I got an email from someone once who said, "Does Fire and Ice Pizza actually have a veranda?" And I'm like, I have no clue, but it doesn't matter because it needed one for the scene, But otherwise, it seems like okay. Yeah, so as long as you're just diligent enough, I think you can more or less find out what you need to know. It's so much easier now than it was 20 years ago because, the novel I'm working on now, I needed to know who was, on 2 baseball teams, Cincinnati and St. Louis in 1931. And that would have been a trip to the library and a bunch of digging for a minor point, a while ago, and now it's like 10 seconds on Google. So I just think there's like no excuse not to do your research anymore because you can find out anything you need to know with pictures. So yeah. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that process of this particular story? So did you picture an older woman and that particular woman, or did you think I want to do a story that's having to do with this time, this place? And can you just kind of track it a little bit?
I'm not sure I can. You know, sometimes these things just sort of arise of a piece. It's like you're just you're lying in bed waiting to go to sleep, or you're on a hike or whatever it is, and it's just like, oh, you know, there it is. You've got this heart of a story somehow.
The idea of what happens in the story, or a character that you see, or bits and pieces?
It varies. It varies. Sometimes it's more detailed than others. The important thing I've found, though, is to like not let that go for too long, because when it first comes up to you'll. I'm sure there's plenty of writers here. You find that, you know, when you first get inspired by that idea, it's like it's got a lot of energy. It's got a lot of vital energy and narrative energy already in it, and you need to like get something down. You need to get something going while that's still happening. Because if you put it aside and let it go too long, that energy just goes out of it. And then when you come back to it, it's like, oh, what was this idea about? Never mind. And you've lost it, you know. Someone was saying recently that, you know, there's only so many ideas floating around the universe, and if one of them comes to you, you've got to grab it, because otherwise it's going somewhere else, you know. So.
Elizabeth Gilbert. Elizabeth Gilbert.
Oh, is that who it was? Okay.
How do you do? How is your editing process? Do you do your own editing? Do you have other readers? Do you have, you know?
Some of each.
Do you put it aside for a while?
Yeah. I do a lot of editing as I go. Then I put stuff aside for periods of time, weeks, months, even. Then I show it to other people whose opinions I trust. And just lather, rinse, repeat. You know, I find it to be very, very difficult to be objective about my own work. Something that I think is brilliant right after I write it, I realize 6 months later is a total piece of shit. And you know, so then you need those friends who can look at it and say, you know, I don't think this is working the way you intend it to be working, and this might be why. And those people are just gold. You know, those people can help you so much. So yeah.
Do you read your own work aloud?
Yeah, that's sort of like the last step before I consider it finished, because a whole bunch of stuff will always come up that you didn't notice that's actually awkward, and that you just kind of, if you're reading, you just go right past it. Doesn't sound right, words are repeated and you didn't notice it, you know, things like that. Yeah.
How do you consider structure when you're writing a book? You're writing a new one now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you give thought to how you want structure, or do you just write, or do you have a structure in mind?
It's kind of a stages thing. The first couple, 3 drafts of a story or a book, I just write it, and just kind of get it all out and try to get out of the way of it, pretty much. And then later you sort of start to get more in editing and revision mode, and so then I go in and start to look at structure and see what needs to be moved around, what's not working here, what can go. You know, the novel that I'm working on now, I just sat down over a period of 3 weeks and cut 100 pages from a 450-page manuscript, because I just saw, okay, this is really, all this stuff is distracting. It's just too distracting. So, and that was partly based on feedback from trusted readers who said, you know, I'm not following this. Why are we supposed to care about this and not that? And so all that stuff is really helpful. And then you can go in and say, oh, I see what they mean. Okay, and just, you know, get out the axe, basically. Yeah.
Once you drop something from a story, do you ever think about it?
I find it psychologically necessary to keep a file for the stuff that's been cut, so that I can be a little braver about cutting it, so that it's not gone forever, because then I'll, oh, maybe I shouldn't cut that, you know. So then if I know I can always go find it again, I'm more willing to cut it. And then I almost never put it back in, but it's just a kind of psychological crutch to help with that process. Yeah. Someone over
Do
here?
those pieces become something else?
Not very often. Not very often. Yeah. Because they're so dependent on the whole interwoven thing that it's hard to make them something standalone.
I'm curious about your process also. I really like your,
But it comes through right away, some of it comes through later.
or do you get the story down and then go back and embellish later?
Some of each. Some of each. Some of it comes through right away, some of it comes through later. Okay. Yes.
I really appreciated your trenchant humor in the story. And also the fact that it wasn't particularly politically correct. And I'm wondering, as you get older, do you find that you're losing your sense of humor? Or
What the hell's that supposed to mean?
I was laughing, I was chuckling when you were reading your story, and I appreciate that. And then I realized, like, I am not laughing as much, and I'm wondering if it's just part of the aging process, and if you could cast some light on that.
This is not really my area of expertise, but I can tell you what I observed in myself, which is that, yeah, as you get older, you have to take care that you don't become dismissive and cranky. Like, oh yeah, I've seen that 100 times before, screw it, you know? It really takes actually some work to kind of keep your heart open, I think, as you age, and it's worth doing. Yeah.
Oh, also my daughter wants to know, MFA program worth it? Yes.
Depends on where it is and what program it is. Overall, I would say absolutely. Yeah, yeah. They're disparaged a lot by some people. I tend not to agree. I benefited tremendously. The main thing I think to do is to, go to a place where there's someone whose work you like and who is willing to be your mentor, and you can establish that ahead of time. And you can write and say, I'd like to come to your program because I love your work and I'd like to study with you. Usually they'll appreciate that. And I think that's really the best way to go about it, so that you go in knowing that you're going to be working with someone whose work you feel an affinity with and who you think can help you. Yes?
How is your journalistic career going to fiction, nonfiction?
I don't know that there's a lot of overlap. It's my day job. It's my job waiting tables, sort of. It's like pianists doing finger exercises. It's just a real different thing. And they're both writing, but beyond that, they're so different that there's really not a lot of crossover or interference, I think. I appreciate my day job, because I get to eat and stuff. But also because a lot of what I write about is intellectually challenging to me, probably not to somebody smarter than I am, but to me it is. And so it keeps me on my toes. I always have to learn a lot of new stuff quickly, and I think that's always a good thing no matter what field you're in.
Carrie, just wanted to comment on the rhythm of that.
Uh-huh.
Piece was so gorgeous. It felt like a poem to me in a lot of ways. And I was wondering, do you do that consciously? That's just how you write, or do you really try to establish that kind of rhythm when you write?
It's both. Mm-hmm. It's both.
Really nice.
Thank you. It's kind of, it's sort of one of those things either you have it or you don't. And I don't always, but I try to. I credit my second grade teacher who had us recite choral poems, all the time with like regular meter and rhyme and all that stuff. It just puts something in you so that you get that ear for that kind of thing. I mean, you don't ever want it to be like that, he said as he looked at the roof kind of thing, but you get something, you get something in your mind, in your ear from that. And I think it can be really helpful. I do notice, I really appreciate it when other writers have it, and I notice right away when they don't. So it's like that. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any advice for young authors who are aspiring to be writers?
Learn a trade. You know, it's funny. That's such a common question. No one has ever actually asked it of me before. I think if it's really what you want to do, just be relentless. Go for it and do it. A certain amount of self-delusion comes in handy, I think, because when I look at, I was determined that I was going to be a writer when I was 15. And when I look at the stuff I wrote when I was 15, 16, 17, it's like, ugh, it's just so terrible. And, thank God nobody was unkind enough to tell me how bad it really was. So I could maintain that delusion, and kind of like gradually improve somewhat. So yeah, I would just say believe in yourself and get good instruction and don't take no. All right, thanks everybody.